It's that time again. The moon is full and there's a chill in the air. Why must I go through this agony every time? It starts with a tingling feeling like pins and needles dancing on my nerve endings, and my skin crawls as a light sweat breaks on the nape of my neck. My heart pounds harder and faster, and things begin to move in slow motion. And this is all just a slight preamble to the pain and horror that will now begin. I can feel my hair follicles spread and grow. As strands of dark new hair emerge from all over my body, enveloping every curve and crevice, creating a protective swath of fur to keep me warm for the evening's activities. My nails enlarge and grow into deep black claws which are as sharp as a razor. Suddenly the world loses color, and all I can see is a black and white universe, yet my sense of smell is much more acute. I can feel my ears bend and reshape, now much larger and dog-like, and I can hear conversations from further away than any normal man ever could. Now the real pain begins as my face contorts into a new shape. The top of my brow down through my nose elongates, becoming more snout-like. And the sound of the cartilage of my head cracking and convulsing into a new shape is frightening. As my eyes narrow into those of a devil, I can feel my teeth crack and grow into enormous fangs, capable of ripping the thickest flesh from any bone. I attempt to cry out, but I've lost the ability to speak. Now only guttural howls leave my throat. I can feel my shoulders broaden, and to double, no, triple in strength, as the knuckles of my hands bend and change into a new, grisly claw formation. At the same time, my feet are also changing, as are my legs, their muscles growing and expanding. And now the bottoms of my feet become as tough as leather. Now the terror truly begins as I lose all sense of myself as a man, and the animal that lurks within takes over. I am now a creature of the night, in search of food, safety, and most of all, you.
Tonight we went on our third date, and I think it's finally going to happen. After weeks of getting to know him better, of making sure it just won't be another one-night stand, I'm going to spend the night at Joe's place. After what I've been through the last couple of months, I deserve a night of pure, unadulterated pleasure. I still don't know what compelled me to walk home that way from work, but if there's such a thing as fate, well, I guess that was it. It was a pleasant summer's day, and I was enjoying my walk home from a rather crummy day at work when I heard it. It was such an unearthly sound, something between a cat in heat and fingernails on a chalkboard. At first, I thought I should run, but my curiosity got the better of me, and I had to see what kind of creature could make such a wail. It seemed to be coming from the side of an old apartment building where those huge trash bins are, and there, underneath a pile of old empty cartons of milk and coffee grounds, was a shoebox, taped up with a huge amount of duct tape. Those unearthly squealing sounds were definitely coming from inside that box. I rummaged through my purse for a knife or something to cut through the tape, and found a fingernail file which I shoved point end first into the duct tape. I tore off the tape and opened the box. I winced. I'd never seen anything like it. A tiny little thing, something like a baby bird, but without the feathers. His skin was more like armor, like the glossy black shell of a beetle, and it looked all scaly, kind of like fish scales. It had 6 legs, 2 directly below its head, 2 in the middle of its body, and 2 at its bottom. Each leg had a hoof-like claw. His head was a cross between a vulture and a cockroach, and its eyes reminded me of a snake, all elliptical and the deepest blood red I've ever seen. Its mouth was like a beak with a very sharp point, and the strangest thing was that it had teeth. Not little fish teeth or reptile teeth, but jagged fangs that looked like a wolf, only smaller. He looked so weak and hungry there in his little shoebox. It took all his strength just to raise his head, and when he slowly opened his little eyes, I could swear he was smiling at me. He just tugged at my heartstrings, I guess, and I was compelled to take him home with me. So I scooped him up, shoebox and all, and headed toward my apartment. When I got him home and opened the box, he seemed at the end of his rope. He was wheezing and panting. I took some bread, sopped it up with some milk, and tried to get him to take it, but he wasn't interested. I tried other food, but he seemed too weak to eat. I finally decided to just give him a little water and let him rest, and got busy making my own dinner. I always make myself a nice dinner, even though it's only for one. It's the principle of the thing. I've got girlfriends who exist on nothing but canned soup and cereal, but I have my pride. Anyway, I was just sitting down to the table with my Cajun chicken, roasted garlic potatoes, and creamed spinach when I heard his little squawk. Thinking he wanted some company, I brought my plate out into the living room to be near him. I took the top off the shoebox, and the water seemed to have revived him because he was hopping up and down like crazy. I was thrilled to see him with so much energy. He hopped out of the box and onto my plate and began to gobble up my food. I was so grateful that he had an appetite, I let him clean my plate. He seemed immediately stronger and more alert. He kept on squawking, so I went into the kitchen and got him the leftovers, and he ate those too. What an incredible appetite that little thing had. Over the next couple of weeks, my little thing kept me occupied, and as he got better, we bonded as friends. When I'd come home from work and open the front door, his little head would pop up out of his shoebox and he'd squawk happily to see me. Then I'd cook dinner for the two of us. I actually began to look forward to seeing him after a long day at the office where it seemed that no one really cared about me. He seemed to be the only creature on this earth who cared about me. Well, I shouldn't really say that. There was someone who was showing some interest. I'd been getting to know this new guy at work. Bill was a couple of years younger than me and very good looking. He'd just been through a divorce and was new in town, so we really didn't know very many people. He had such an easy manner. I guess some would call him a smooth talker, and before long, I invited him over for a home-cooked meal. During dinner, Bill was a perfect gentleman, complimenting me on my fine home cooking. But every now and then, I'd catch him glancing uneasily at my little thing, and a look of annoyance or maybe even disgust seemed to show on his face. Finally, Bill seemed so preoccupied with my little thing that I decided to bring him up as a topic of conversation. That was a mistake, because to be honest with you, I didn't appreciate what he was getting at. He thought my little thing was ugly and should be disposed of. I told him that he was crazy, that my little thing was a godsend to me and kept me company on many a lonely night. Bill just smiled and snuggled up next to me and said that keeping me company on a lonely night was his job now. I thought that was very sweet, and we snuggled closer. I tried to remember how long it had been since a man had held me. I couldn't even think back that far, but something was wrong. Bill was going a bit too far, and I found myself struggling against him. He started to get upset, and he wouldn't take no for an answer. What is it with men? I mean, they just don't seem to get it that women like it slow. Instead, they pounce on us as if we were pieces of meat. If he would have just taken it easy, everything would have... well, things would have turned out better. As I struggled against Bill, from the corner of my eye, I could see the little thing. He must have been watching us the whole time. The little thing shuddered slightly and then grew. I mean, he really blew up to what must have been close to 10 feet tall, his odd-looking head pushing up against the ceiling of my apartment. I mean, that's how tall he got. Bill noticed that I was distracted by something behind him. He turned around and started shrieking. For a macho guy, he sure screamed like a girl. Then my little thing unhinged his beak-like mouth, his jaw dropping as a snake does when it gets ready to eat a rodent. Suddenly, a horrible grayish spray gushed out of his mouth. It smelled so hideous that Bill became sick and started choking on his own vomit, his eyes rolling to the back of his head. As Bill lost consciousness, the creature let out the most awful hissing sound, and a long purple-red tongue rolled out of his mouth, wrapped around Bill, and drew him into his gullet. It was like a bad traffic accident. I didn't want to watch, but I couldn't look away. I could see Bill's form struggling as the creature forced him down into what must have been its stomach, and for a moment I thought I saw the form of an elbow sticking out of the creature's gut. The creature seemed to digest him in a matter of seconds. I stood there practically out of my mind. Then, just as suddenly as he grew, the little thing shrank back down to his tiny little size, hopped back into his shoebox like nothing ever happened, and let out a light-hearted little shriek. Horrified, I left the apartment and ran down the street to the corner bar where I tried to regain my composure and think about what to do. I mean, Bill was being a jerk, and the little creature was just trying to protect me, wasn't he? But I thought, well, what's going to happen when Bill turns up missing? Then I realized that Bill had no family here. No one even knew he was coming over to my place, so after knocking back a couple of gin and tonics, I went back home to have a talk with my little thing. He was resting comfortably in his shoebox as I came in, so I gently thanked him for protecting me, but made it very clear that he must not do this again, no matter how threatened I might be, and that it was very bad to eat human beings. He looked at me with his big red eyes as I patted his funny little head, and I knew he understood. I thought it was strange when about a week later, my landlord dropped by unexpectedly before I left for work to collect the rent. As I let him in, he confessed that he'd been getting complaints from the other tenants about awful shrieking sounds coming from my apartment and wanted to know if everything was okay. As he nosed around, my mind raced to come up with an explanation. Then he came upon the little thing. I could tell he was repulsed. He turned to me and told me pets were not allowed in this building and that I'd have to get rid of it. He seemed surprised by my immediate panic, then realized that I wasn't looking at him. I was looking over his shoulder. Feeling the towering shadow grow from behind him, he turned and faced the creature as it dropped its hinge-like jaw. As the creature started to pull him into his mouth with his hideous tongue, the landlord began to struggle and braced himself against the creature's gaping mouth with his hand, accidentally impaling the fleshy part of his hand on the creature's razor-sharp teeth. He screamed in agony as the monster used its knife-like claws to instantly slice his head from his body, silencing his screams as his vocal cords snapped from his neck. As the landlord's head tumbled to the floor, the creature gulped down his entire body in one swift motion. Then it picked up the head with its claw and popped it into its mouth, just like you'd eat an after-dinnerman after a fancy meal. I backed up slowly as the creature quickly digested his victim and reduced himself to his regular tiny size. It was then I realized that the creature wasn't out to protect me. Oh no, it was only protecting itself. It was all I could do to make it to work that day. I was a basket case. All I could think about was how to get rid of that little evil thing. Why didn't I just walk past that dumpster? Why did I have to get involved? As I came home from work that night, I could feel those blood-red eyes watching me carefully, checking out my every move, trying to see if I was friend or foe. I had to act as if nothing had happened, but deep down, I knew I had to do something. I could hardly close my eyes that night, let alone sleep. At some point I must have drifted off, but all through the night I had horrible nightmares. There was only one that I remember clearly. In the dream, I got out of bed in the middle of the night, picked up my pillow, and went over to where the little thing was resting quietly, a tiny little wheeze coming from the breathing holes over its beak. I took the pillow and jammed it over his beak as he fought furiously for air. Then, from around the pillow came the claws, growing in size until they reached my throat, and his sharp talon-like nails pierced my neck like you'd pop open a can of soda. Blood was gushing everywhere. I couldn't even scream because the blood was clotting my vocal cords. I woke up with a start and jumped out of bed, the sweat dripping off me. I looked over at the little thing and saw its red eyes glowing back at me in the dark. The next morning, as I got ready for work, I could barely control my panic. My hands were shaking so much I could barely button my blouse. I was consumed with one question: how to get rid of that little evil thing. Whatever I did, I knew I'd have to be careful to surprise him. As I pondered his fate in mind, I was snapped back to reality by the roar of a garbage truck coming down the street. I've always hated those damn noisy trucks. I've always felt sorry for myself to have the apartment right above the dumpster. But not today. I looked down at the little evil thing. He was resting quietly in his shoebox. I knew I had to make my move. I tiptoed to where the duct tape was stored, slowly and quietly peeled off a couple of strips and placed them on the box's lid. After making my way back, I slammed the lid onto the shoebox containing my little friend and rushed to the window. I could feel it beginning to shudder as I approached the window, and just as I released it, I heard a hissing wail coming from the box. I watched in relief as it hit the pile of garbage in the truck and backed away from the window. Suddenly, I just wanted to get the hell out of that apartment. But that's all in the past. I've closed that chapter. On with my new life with Joe. I met him a day or so after I got rid of the little evil thing. We met around the corner at the supermarket. Normally, I wouldn't have had the guts to ask him out, but after my experience with that little evil thing, I realized that life is just too short. I mean, who knows what tomorrow could bring? And so far, it's worked out even better than I expected. Joe's a real find. He listens, he's got a great sense of humor, and he's very caring. I think he could be the one. We've been taking it really slow, but tonight we're going to take that big step, and I hope he's not disappointed. We're almost to his apartment now, and he's apologizing, saying those typical bachelor things like what a mess his place is. He opens the door and lets me in. He says he can't wait to show me this little pet that he's been taking care of, but I don't really hear him very well now, because standing in front of me is a 10-foot-tall nightmare, and his jaw is dropping in front of me.
He had always been a very quiet boy. When he emerged from the womb and the doctor slapped his rosy pink behind, he didn't cry. He simply let out a tiny gasp, and that was it. For the first couple of years, his parents thought he might be mute, even though the doctors insisted his voice box was normal. Give him time, was the general prognosis. He'll speak when he has something to say. He did very well in school, as far as learning was concerned. Very bright, his teachers would always say, but very quiet. Since he was a good boy, his mother and father took his silence in stride. If he wanted to speak, well, they figured he'd do it when he felt good and ready. After all, it wasn't as if he never spoke. Once, when he was only 2.5, he told his mother simply, "Food," and she understood instantly he wanted to eat, so it wasn't like he couldn't communicate. In fact, it was a bit eerie how he could just say a word or two and immediately get what he wanted. His mother worried about this from time to time, but the boy would tell her, "Relax," and those nervous thoughts floated away from her mind. Children, on the other hand, were another matter entirely. At school, he was taunted and bullied by several of the older and bigger children. They'd call him zipper mouth, weenie, dork face, and that good old standby dummy. He'd ignore them, but every once in a while it would be too much to take, and he'd be forced to use a word or two on the tiny infidels. When Joey Johnson got into his face one day, poking him in the chest and calling him puke face, egging him on with the standard intellectual query, "What are you going to do about it?" the child simply looked at Joey dead in the eye and whispered, "Go blind." Soft enough for only Joey to hear. Suddenly Joey was doubled over in pain, crying about knives in his head. He was escorted to the school nurse, who called for an ambulance to take him to the hospital, where he was pronounced permanently blind, although no eye damage found. When Ricky Badamente put a dead rat in the child's lunch pail and howled with laughter at the look of disgust in the child's face, the child leaned in close to Ricky and said, "Eat rat." Ricky plucked up the dead rat from the ground and unflinchingly bit the head off the rat. As the other children screamed in horror, Ricky was whisked off to get a series of rabies shots just in case. Being confused and concerned by the odd behavior demonstrated by the boy's interaction with the other children, his teachers would talk to the boy's mother. But after a comforting word from the child, she would be calm and at peace with her sweet boy once again. The child loved and cherished his father dearly. His father was actually a bit like him, quiet and thoughtful. Together they would spend hours building model ships, or just taking strolls through the park, never a word straying from either one's mouth. There was a relaxed contentment between the two, and the child would occasionally tell his father, "I love you." Nothing more, nothing less. His father had a small hardware store in town, and was always struggling to make ends meet. When the child was 12, he went down to the city hall with his father. It seemed that the property taxes on the house were unpaid, and his father went to plead for an extension to give him time to raise the additional sum. The clerk was an unbearable little man who insisted that no extensions could be granted, and that the taxes must be paid now. His father, normally a calm and rational man, got into a heated argument with the clerk. The child's father told the child to go and wait out in the car, as the child seemed uncomfortable by the escalation of the dispute between the two men. As he walked out the door, he was practically bowled over by two phone company workers hurrying out to their van. He noticed that the van was non-commercial, not the usual blue and yellow striped phone company vehicle. This struck him as rather odd. He had walked across the street and was waiting in the car when suddenly an enormous explosion burst forth from the City Hall building. He averted his eyes as debris shuddered by the car. Then, realizing his father was still inside, he charged out of the car and ran into the building, smoke billowing out and fire raging within. He didn't manage to get too far inside before the walls started to collapse around him. He was dazed by the screams and cries from within, and suddenly a hand grabbed him by the shoulder and pulled him out of the building and onto the street. A large fireman was trying to save his life, and the boy realized that there was nothing he could do. His father was gone. As he thought of his poor, sweet father being burned alive in this place, his mind blazed with hatred. Hatred towards that clerk that wouldn't give him a measly extension on the taxes. Hatred towards the kids who taunted him year after year. Hatred that raged deep within him like a volcano until suddenly his mind snapped. As he stared at the blazing inferno, the child noticed news reporters piling onto the scene, babbling about terrorist bombers and the political implications, and they were annoying innocent people by shoving microphones into their faces, doing their best to make them cry in close-up, bucking for that ever-elusive Emmy Award. A national news reporter reached to the boy and asked him if he'd witnessed the bombing. The boy looked at him and said, "Yes." Suddenly, all the reporters and cameramen were clamoring around the boy, vying for the news story of the year award, prodding him, badgering him for details on exactly what he had witnessed. The boy paused for what seemed an eternity as everyone waited breathlessly until he was sure all the cameras were on him. Amazing digital cameras with crystal clear sound that would be beamed instantly to satellites high above the earth that just as quickly beamed back around the world for the population of the entire planet to hear. And he uttered two simple words: kill yourselves.
I'm running as fast as I can, but I can feel it getting closer and closer as I turn down another street. I see a rusty door on a strange brick building and I open it, entering a dark corridor with lots of steel tubes and steam seeping out of the conduit. As I turn down another corridor, I hear the door open back behind me. It's still following me, and I can't seem to shake it. Who or what is it, and why is it after me? I come to a grinding halt as the corridor comes to a dead end, but I see a ladder built onto the wall structure and I start to climb. I hear deep, heavy breathing behind me getting even closer. I reach a ceiling at the top of the ladder with a small attic-like panel that I push open and pull myself through. I'm almost into the next room when I feel it pulling on my legs, which are dangling in midair. It's got me, and it's pulling me back to it. I begin to scream, and suddenly I wake up with a muffled cry. My heart's pounding as sweat drips off my face. I look over at Daphne as she lets a puff of air out of her cheeks and rolls onto her side. I get up for a glass of water, and as I return to bed, she wakes up.
Another bad dream?
Yeah, it's the same dream, but I got further this time before it got me. I wish I knew why these nightmares keep happening.
It's all that stress of trying to be the #1 salesman of the year. It's preying on your subconscious.
Yeah, more psychobabble. I think I gotta stop eating pizza so late at night.
Well, that wouldn't hurt. But you gotta do something. You look like shit. And the boss keeps asking me if you're on drugs or something because of those dark circles under your eyes. Now, I know I'm your secretary, but there are only so many excuses I can make for you.
I know. What can I say? If I sleep too long, I know it'll get me. That's why I keep waking up. I just got this feeling that I have to wake up before it kills me. Call it gut instinct.
More like nut instinct. You really think a full night's sleep is going to kill you? What's really going to kill you is not getting enough rest. Now roll over and go to sleep.
But I couldn't. I lay there the rest of the night trying to remember when these chase dreams started. It seemed like I'd been having them forever. Little by little, they got more involved. They almost always began right where they left off, only I was never caught. I was given a new start. At first, they were kind of exciting, but now, oh man, how I long for a good sex dream. Or at least a dream where I find a bunch of money. I'm in the office the next day getting shit from the boss about losing a new account. He says I'm erratic and suggests I work harder. Yeah, right. Why didn't I think of that? I just want to pound him in the face. I mean, how can he say I'm not working hard? I work harder than anyone in the place. I'm just exhausted because of those damn dreams. I sit down at my desk and start to go over a new account when suddenly my can sense that somehow it's here. It's coming down the hall toward me. I lock the door, then I hear it pushing the door open, splintering the wood as it squeezes and bends the door, causing it to buckle. I jump to my feet, throw open the window, and leap out, which is no great feat since we're on the ground floor, and begin to hightail it down the street. Suddenly I can hear it behind me, practically breathing down my collar as I run into the local 5 and dime store. People begin to scream as they see it, but I'm not about to look around to see what's after me. Instead, I throw down shelves of products, hoping to slow it down a little. Yeah, like slipping on a bucket of lifesavers is really gonna kill it. I reach the back door and I'm almost through it when it grabs my leg. As it reels me in, I feel my flesh being peeled off of me. The pain is unbearable. I feel my leg tendon snapping off and I cry out loud, and suddenly I wake up at my desk. The door opens and Daphne rushes in.
Jesus, Mike! Are you okay?
Yeah, I must have nodded off at my desk. It was another one of those damn nightmares. But this one seems so real, even more real than the others.
You gotta take a vacation or something. You just can't go on like this. Look, why don't we take off for a few days to Cancun? We'll relax by the beach.
Are you nuts? The boss just chewed me out for screwing off too much, and you tell me to take a vacation? I don't think so.
Fine, don't take my advice, but you better do something or you're gonna end up in the loony bin, and I mean soon.
She's right. She's always right. I know that if I don't get a solid night's sleep soon, I'm headed for Looney Land. But if I sleep too long, that thing, whatever it is, will really get me, and I won't wake up at all. Boy, do I need a cup of coffee. Tonight, Daphne and I are having dinner, and I know she's really bugged. She's just eating her food and sighing a lot, which is a clear sign that we need to talk. Well, what did I do now?
What's it matter? Why should I tell you? You never listen to me anyway.
I know, you're pissed off because I won't take a vacation, right?
It's not the vacation, it's you. You look like something the cat dragged in, and you won't do anything to take care of yourself.
Look, I've told you over and over, I can't take time off, and I can't sleep for too long or it will get me.
Who? The boogeyman?
Fine. You can tease me all you like, but there's something out there that's trying to get me, and I refuse to give in to it.
You are really bent. Don't you realize that it's the lack of sleep that's making you believe that something's out to get you? It's a textbook case of paranoid delusion.
Call it what you want, but I'm not crazy. I'm not gonna let that thing kill me.
All right. All right. Just don't say I didn't warn you. Listen, you want to get a drink or something?
We took a walk to the local coffee shop because I knew that booze would just knock me straight out. We talked about coworkers, the movies, anything but my sleeping problem, which we both knew would just stir up trouble. I was feeling kind of tired despite the 3 cups of coffee in me, and when we got back to the apartment I headed right for bed and plopped myself down. Not long after I heard the doorbell ring. I glanced at the clock. 11:30. Let Daphne answer it. But who would be calling this time of night? As she opened the door, I got up to see who it was. A hideous tentacle-like arm reached around her and squeezed her so hard that her insides burst forth like you'd pop a pimple. I wanted to save her, but it was too late. It had come for me. I had to make my escape. Leaping to my feet, I threw open the back window which leads to the fire escape platform. As I extended the ladder and shuttled down, I saw the tentacles reaching out for me. I hit the ground running, unable to get the gruesome image of Daphne out of my mind. Poor Daphne. Why wouldn't she believe me when I told her it was merging into our reality? I ran about a block when I saw an old deserted warehouse. I ducked inside, hoping the thing didn't see me. I had climbed a set of stairs to the second floor when I heard the creak of the front door slowly opening. It found me. I quietly crept down a long corridor with several doors. Hey, this could be good. If I could make the creature think I was in one room while I was actually in another, I might be able to make my escape. I popped open the door to a room several feet down the hall, leaving it ajar, then hurried over to another door by the stairs and flung myself in, closing it just as I heard the monster reach the corridor. I held my breath as I waited for it to go down the hall to my waiting trap. I could sense the thing pause by my door and waited for what seemed an eternity. Finally, I heard it slither toward the open door. It had taken the bait. I threw open the door and made a mad sprint for the stairs when I tripped. As I fell head over heels from the corner of my eye, I saw the creature for the first time in all its ghoulish glory. It had left a tentacled arm in front of my door as it waited by the second door, knowing I would trip as I tried to make my escape. It had laid its own trap for me, and as I tried to get to my feet, it loomed over me. It was huge, and it was really here. This was no dream. This was hell, and I cried in agony as it slowly dug into my flesh with its knife-like suckers on its tentacled arms. Oh God, the pain's incredible. It won't stop torturing me. How long will this go on?
Please, Doctor, can't you do anything for him?
I'm sorry. He's just too far gone. That sedative you put in his coffee didn't just get him drowsy. He was so exhausted he slipped into a coma. All we can do is wait for him to come out of it.
But you told me if I gave him the sedative that he'd get the sleep he needed and everything would be all right. How long will he be like this?
A few days, a week, a year. We just don't have any way of knowing. At least he's resting peacefully.
The pain is overwhelming. The thing is talking to me in my head, describing the horrors it has in store for me, laughing at me as it slices through a piece of what used to be my leg. It says, "From now on, we have all eternity together."
You could have knocked Bob Farn over with a feather. He'd never won anything before, and now a voice on the phone was informing him that he was the lucky winner of an all-expense-paid trip to Africa for two, just for filling out an entry form at the local market for some new drink they were promoting called Congo Cooler. He hung up the phone and let out a howl of joyous victory, then looked slowly around his empty home. A sudden wave of sadness came over him. It had been 6 weeks since his wife Mary had walked out on him, and he didn't have any really close friends. Who could he ask to go with him? After a few calls to some casual acquaintances, Bob shrugged his shoulders and decided he'd rather go by himself anyhow. Being a film developer, he was used to a solitary life, spending day after day alone in the dark room making pictures appear out of thin air. In fact, he had to admit that he enjoyed his solitude most of the time, whether at home or at work. After all, he had his precious gem collection, his baseball card collection, and his rare record collection to keep him busy. When Mary had declared that it just wasn't working out anymore and left for good, he barely looked up from his gemstone magazine to see the door slam behind her. No, Bob Farn was an independent man who would take his trip by himself, for himself. The flight from Los Angeles to Johannesburg was extremely long, but Bob used his time wisely. He was reading up on all the different excursions and day trips he could take when a gem mine tour just outside of Sero, Botswana, caught his eye. There must be some really special gems there, he thought. Something really out of the ordinary he could add to his collection. Johannesburg was quite a departure for Bob, who wasn't used to much beyond his dark room. Between the mosquitoes, the strange smells, and the unusual food, he found the entire trip a bit overwhelming. But in spite of his disorientation, Bob was able to organize his trip to the gem mine. He spent a whole day just getting to Sero and ended up spending the night in a third-rate hotel complete with rats and other vermin he didn't even want to think about. Instead, Bob dreamed of the gem mine and his hopes of making a great find. Unfortunately, the mine was not what Bob was hoping for. It was abandoned, and only the most common gems were encased in glass for the novice to look upon in a very boring, museum-like setting. Bob had been expecting hands-on digging, or at least some sense of searching for that special, once-in-a-lifetime treasure. Finally, the tour guide took the group to a lower, more obscure part of the mine and showed them a tunnel that led to an area that was considered cursed. Over the years, 40 miners had died trying to excavate gems from this area, and it was decided to be kept off limits. As the tour guide shuffled everyone off to the next part of the tour, Bob lingered behind, then slipped away to explore. The instant he stepped off the main path, Bob was blinded by the absolute absence of light. He reached for his small pocket flashlight to guide him. After several minutes of fruitless searching, he heard the voice of the guide calling after him. The guide had obviously seen his light shining down the tunnel, and Bob realized his solo expedition was now over. But just as he was heading out of the tunnel, his flashlight caught hold of something that bathed the entire chamber in a brief explosion of red light. After recovering from the shock, Bob tried to recreate the event by scanning over the rubble with his flashlight, and suddenly there was another burst of light. But this time Bob held the light firmly on the source, a beautiful purple-red gem. As Bob stood in awe, engulfed in the scarlet glow of the cavern, his eyes were drawn to a figure etched on the wall just above the gem. It seemed to be an ancient tribal rendering of a man wearing the gem on a necklace, surrounded by wavy lines that seemed to represent some radiant energy. Suddenly, Bob heard footsteps approaching. He realized the guide was almost upon him, so he swooped down, picked up the gem, and shoved it into his pocket. The guide scolded him for going off on his own, reminding him of how dangerous this tunnel could be. Bob didn't even hear him. He was so excited about his rare find, he could barely contain his glee. That evening, Bob carefully examined the gem in the privacy of his rat-infested hotel room. He rifled through his trusty pocket gem book, but was unable to find anything resembling the red gem. Bob had a hunch he had found something rare. When he got back to his humdrum life in Los Angeles, Bob had the gem fastened to a small gold chain and proudly wore the stone on his chest as a memento of his trip. Over the next couple of weeks, Bob spent all his spare time trying to figure out what kind of gem he had in his possession. He went to the library and took out every precious gem book he could get his hands on, but still, he could not find a gem that resembled his. Sure, there were purple gems and red gems and variations of the two, but not one had this particular vibrancy of colors. Stranger still was the fact that this stone radiated a prism of colors like no other gem Bob had ever seen. Sure, certain gems gave off that rainbow effect when light hit them a certain way, but Bob's gem did that even when light wasn't present. Even in the dark room, where he ruined more than one set of negatives because of the iridescent light randomly radiating from the gem. During the course of his gem research, Bob started to feel a little odd. He'd been eating more than usual, but strangely enough, he seemed to be losing weight, and he felt tired all the time. He called his doctor and was told that he must have picked up a bug in Africa. Despite Bob's protestations that he had been extremely careful not to drink the local tap water or eat anything that wasn't thoroughly cooked, the doctor assured him that after taking the antibiotics, he would be fine in a couple of days. But a week later, Bob was still feeling drained, and now his legs were starting to feel a bit strange. They had a peculiar tingling sensation like pins and needles dancing on his skin. Bob called the doctor's office again and this time insisted on making an appointment to see the doctor. After taking the necessary blood tests, the doctor recommended using ultrasound to take a look at the inside of Bob's legs. Upon viewing the video monitor of the ultrasound, they discovered thousands of writhing, squiggly lines in the section where his muscles should have been. At this point, the doctors determined that the squiggly lines were worm-like parasites that were eating the muscle away from Bob's leg. The doctor informed Bob that they could remove the parasites by means of a simple procedure, but they would have to cut open his legs to remove the parasites. Realizing he had to do something, Bob consented to the procedure, and they immediately prepared him for surgery. As the doctors performed the initial incision on Bob's leg, dozens of tiny, pink, thread-like worms poked their heads out of his flesh. The doctors then used tweezers to remove the writhing creatures. Upon closer examination, the doctors realized that these creatures were unlike any they had ever seen. Rather than proceed with the initial procedure, the doctor decided to close Bob's leg up and run an emergency analysis on these strange creatures. As they examined the parasites under a microscope, the doctors were fascinated to find that their fleshy, pink worm-like bodies had no other features besides a leech-like sucker mouth. They also analyzed the parasite's DNA structure and were shocked to discover that it wasn't that of a viral bacteria, but rather the DNA of a human being. Not only human, but specifically Bob Farr's muscle tissue. Armed with this new information, the doctor's plan of action changed radically. They realized that the creatures weren't eating Bob's muscle, they were Bob's muscle. They were transforming from his muscle into these hideous creatures. They were living off of Bob's blood. Given this diagnosis, there was only one way to stop the parasites from infesting his entire bloodstream. They must amputate both of Bob's legs. As they severed his legs from his body, the maggots swarmed out onto the floor. Vicious pink bugworms danced and scurried about as the hospital staff scrambled to scoop them up. They spewed forth by the thousands, fleeing into any nook and cranny they could find to take over, and they made hideous sounds, like the hiss from an empty aerosol can as they wriggled about. They left a dense trail of blood in their wake as they found themselves evicted from their warm, fleshy home. The doctors sealed Bob's legs in body bags and immediately took them to the incinerator to be burned, thereby putting an end to the parasite invasion. A chilling, high-pitched cry came from the incinerator as the parasites were burned into oblivion. The next day, as Bob swam towards consciousness, he tried to regain his bearings. As his eyes slowly focused, he scanned his surroundings and recognized them as the hospital recovery room. Since he was feeling a lot better, Bob assumed the operation was a success. Curious to see the condition of his legs, Bob threw back the sheets and screamed, staring at the two ghastly purple stumps where his legs once were. Horrified, Bob rang for the doctor, who regretfully explained the situation to him. The doctors would continue to run tests on the parasites to see if they could find a way to stop their transformation, but in the meantime, Bob seemed healthy and parasite-free. The next week found Bob trying to adjust to his new wheelchair and dealing with the frustration of the loss of his legs. He figured he must have been bitten by some strange, mutated breed of mosquito in that horrible flea bag hotel. He cursed the day he ever won that trip to Africa and even thought of suing the makers of Congo Cooler, but his lawyer informed him that the small print on the prize ticket made it quite clear that he could not hold the company liable for his current condition. Oh, how Bob wished he had never gone to Africa. The only thing worthwhile about that cursed trip was the beautiful red gem he had discovered. That was a true blessing. Bob now spent his days in a wheelchair, obsessed with discovering what kind of gem he had, poring over book after book, but he had yet to learn its identity. The gem wasn't listed anywhere. Bob's excitement grew as he felt he might really have something incredibly rare and possibly worth a fortune. The next week, he started to feel odd again. But this time, instead of his legs, Bob now felt a strange tingling sensation in his arms. Reluctantly, he went back to the doctor, who delivered the bad news. The parasites could only be killed by fire, and even worse, it looked like the muscle tissue in his arms was indeed turning into those foul little maggots. Once again, Bob underwent surgery, and as they severed his arms from his torso, the vile creatures cascaded into a bloody waterfall, rushing for cover. Blood trails from the creatures painted the floor as if some mad artist had gone berserk with a fine-haired brush, applying thin red abstract Dali-esque lines to an otherwise stark white linoleum canvas. A new intern ran from the room clutching his mouth. The stench from these foul little creatures was more than he could bear. One severed arm that was left unattended for a few moments seemed to move of its own accord as the parasites pushed the arm with their combined putrid locomotion. A nurse shrieked as the arm made its way toward her, wiggling fingers and all, as a surgeon plucked it up, shoved it into a body bag, and sent it to his fiery execution. There was quite a commotion in the old hospital that day. Now poor Bob was a quadriplegic. It took him a long time to recover both mentally as well as physically from his ordeal. Weeks later, he was back home, more despondent than ever. The only thing Bob had to hold on to was the dream of taking his place in the history books as the discoverer of a rare new gem. Bob now spent his days obsessed with determining the identity of his gem. He pored over every book he could find, but still he could not find the gem listed anywhere. As a last-ditch effort, Bob sent his live-in nurse to the library to take out some books on African mythology, in hopes that they might contain some information about the stone which hung from the neck of his limbless body. Myra returned with several new books and set them on Bob's specially designed table, which propped the book up so he could turn the pages with a stick held in his mouth. After a few hours, Bob came upon a page with an exact drawing of the gem. Excitedly, he read the passage beside the drawing. The Najuna stone. This mythical gem was believed to have been cursed by the gods and flung deep within a pit in southern Africa hundreds of years ago. Legend has it that it infected a now extinct tribe with a horrible plague of parasites, and that the stone kills whomever holds it closest to them, turning the gem a deeper shade of red. Suddenly, Bob felt the creatures swarming in his tongue, making it pulse and ache and swell, causing him to have trouble breathing. Bob tried to get the amulet off him, but without any arms or hands, it was an impossible task. Hearing his pain gasps, Myra ran in and turned Bob toward her, and she saw the terror in his eyes. She asked him what was wrong, but his tongue was so swollen he couldn't speak to tell her to get the necklace off him. The amulet seemed to be turning a richer, more vibrant shade of red as the maggots crawled into his head. He felt a thread-like form pop through his tongue like an open sore, and he felt the creatures weave and shimmer through his nasal passages, into the back of his eye sockets, burrowing into his brain, burning, itching. His head was on fire with pain. He stared back down at the stone as it turned redder and redder, brighter and brighter. He opened his mouth to scream, but all that came out were thousands and thousands of hissing pink monstrosities. Then suddenly everything went black.